Mark, thank you very much for giving us your time. And you're best known as the publisher of ClimateDepot.com, and you're no stranger to controversy. You've been called many things. You were named one of 5 criminals against humanity and against the Earth itself. That's a rare feat. You're the first person I've met that's achieved that. One of 17 climate killers, a central cell of the climate denial machine. But you've also been awarded the Accuracy in Media Journalism Award and many others in praise of your work. To say that you're a polarising figure would probably understate the case by a fair margin. So let's start at the beginning. When did climate change first come to your attention? When did you decide to start covering it? And why aren't you convinced that man-made CO2 is one of the primary drivers of climate change?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not a scientist. I'm an investigative reporter, but I do play a scientist on TV occasionally. And I'd say the first time I ever got involved with global warming was 1997. I've been involved in environmentalism a lot. In fact, I've been working on Amazon rainforest deforestation issues. I always considered myself a Republican, except when it came to the environment. I remember I used to be angry at the Reagan administration for putting in roads into logging areas where I wanted to see roadless areas in these logging communities because I was always wanted to be a forest ranger and all that. So when global warming came along, by the time it came along, I had started investigating Amazon rainforest, and I was realizing that we had been sold a bill of goods, if you will, from the environmental community. So I was skeptical initially of global warming in 1997 when I started professionally looking at it. And it was a couple years later that I started doing a series that became my beat, if you will, when I was at Cybercast News Service, and interviewed everyone from Fred Singer to Pat Michaels, and I went to UN conferences. I went to multiple UN conferences all over the world, in South Africa and South America. And it was just, to me, it was astonishing because what I saw presented was a political campaign from the beginning. And so before we even talked about the science at all, just the presentation of this. And then when I started investigating, when I moved to the United States Senate, and worked under the Environment and Public Works Committee under Senator James Inhofe, who was the chairman and then later the ranking member, we started investigating, the UN, the abuses, and we realized this was a political narrative. And we knew this long before the ClimateGate scandal broke. We had a list of reforms from our committee that we recommended to the still in then Chief Rajendra Pachauri of the IPCC. And to put it simply, one of the scientists who we work with put it best. He said the UN IPCC was very simply a political organization masquerading as a science body. And once you realize that this was all steeped in politics, you realize the official narrative was nothing more than a political campaign, then you start scratching the surface of the science. And I just testified in May of 2013 at a congressional hearing, field hearing on global warming. And I cited so many prestigious scientists like Will Happer of Princeton University and many others. But the basic gist of it is the Earth is currently in a CO2 famine. In other words, we've had ice ages with CO2 at 2,000 parts per million, and we've had CO2 20 times higher than today with temperatures very similar than today. So the idea that CO2 is the tail that wags the dog doesn't hold up in the geologic record. And we now know from peer-reviewed studies, be they peer-reviewed studies on the lack of volcanic dust in the atmosphere, which could account for up to 1/3 or 1/4 of the temperature increase since the 1960s. We now know that ocean cycles, water vapor, methane, tilt of the Earth's axis, all these other various feedbacks. It's quite literally hundreds of factors, as Philip Stott from the UK, the scientist, put it. Hundreds of factors make up our global temperature. The idea that we can self-select one of those hundreds of factors and say this is the tail that wags the dog, and not only that, we're going to then try to control our regulations of this one single factor, the human element, and forgetting the natural part, and that way thereby regulate the weather, the climate, and use that one factor to then come up with carbon taxes, UN treaties, cap and trade, environmental regulations, all sorts of shutting down coal plants, regulating fracking, cutting back carbon-based energy, all in the name of being afraid of CO2, a trace essential gas in the atmosphere. It just didn't hold up. And so to answer your question, how I really got involved in this, in 2006 when I went to the United States Senate, I went there as a communication director and the speechwriter and the climate, I call it a climate researcher, but I'm not a scientist, I'm more of a climate investigator, if you will. I actually went to the senator and had a strategy and actually had a memo in 2006 that I worked on and released it to the committee, and the idea was we were going to collect scientists' names, and we went in earnest on that. And in the first release, we had 400 dissenting scientists from around the world. Then we went up to 650, then 700, and by 2010, about almost 2011, it was over 1,000 scientists. And this was the key, because we ended up collecting the scientists, their names, their studies, their biographies, in all one document. It was a 255-page report in the end. These reports that we did were cited by Gallup polling organization as one of the key reasons in the United States why people grew skeptical. They said the highlighting of skeptical scientists by Republican politicians, and the #1 Republican politician highlighting skeptical scientists was Senator James Inhofe of the committee that I work for. And in doing so, that and the Heartland Institute conferences, they had skeptical conferences, we were able to turn a ragtag army, if you will, of spread out skeptics all over the globe into a cohesive, rapid response team. And we used the United States Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. We were the first on federal taxpayer, U.S. taxpayer money to publish the U.S. Senate Skeptics Guide to Global Warming in 2006. It outraged people. How dare they use taxpayer money for that? We published that. We published a dissenting scientist report. We then did a blog where, I think it was Newsweek said, we turned our committee website and facts into basically a daily news report of the global warming skepticism. We ended up winning the Gold Mouse Award. So in getting involved in this, I worked with, and still do, dozens of scientists on a daily basis, and then eventually hundreds, and got all their statements and collated, put these reports together. And it's just, to me, astounding. And the fact that the other side would never debate told me that there was something afoot here. They didn't want to debate because they didn't want to dignify it. And the fact that they are willing to debate now in 2013, 2014, it's amazing to me, the sea change in that, because they realized that by not debating, by trying to ignore, they were getting their rear ends kicked in public opinion, but also they were losing they have been losing the scientific debate.
Can I just pick you up for a second? You mentioned the fact that you were publishing some reports on taxpayers' money. Let's talk about taxpayers' money for a second, because that's been a significant part of this. An enormous amount of money has been spent by governments. What is the result of the spending? What have they been funding?
That's a very good question. There's a study out, John Cook and Dana Nutelli, with this idea that there's a 90, they change it all the time, 97 or 98% consensus among the peer-reviewed studies, let alone that 2/3 of the studies that they even looked at didn't take a position on global warming. But what ends up happening is, I don't want to sit here and say, oh, this scientist only believes this because they're paying them. That's not that simple. Yeah. Here's the way you can explain where all this money went. And there's been estimates up to $80 billion in the last 2 decades. There have been, if you look at the money, Al Gore alone pledged to spend $300 million a year promoting global warming alarmism. And then you look at the other side, the Union of Concerned Scientists, which was reported by NBC News, a few years back, 2007 or 2008, said that ExxonMobil, the largest oil company, had funded $16 to $19 million to groups skeptical of global warming. Well, you start looking at the facts. One United States Department of Agriculture farm grant of $20 million to study how farm odors contribute to global warming exceeded all the money ExxonMobil was ever accused of giving to skeptics by one of their harshest critics, the liberal environmental group, Union of Concerned Scientists. So you realize something's wrong. Then you start looking at operating budgets of the Heartland Institute, of my parent company, CFACT, of CEI, and then you compare it to the Sierra Club and Greenpeace and Natural Resources Defense Council, and you start realizing who's the David, who's the Goliath, and then it's the environmentalists that are the Goliath. And then you add into that the foundation money, the George Soros money, you add into that the Tides Foundation, then you add into that the UN, the whole UN apparatus, and the idea that all these countries, the political leaders handpick the scientists to represent them at these UN conferences. Well, they're not going to pick skeptical scientists in general. They're going to pick scientists that toe the line, especially developing world, which is going to want climate aid. They're talking hundreds of billions of dollars, or at least billions of dollars, in money that's going to come because of any bad weather event is, of course, now attributable to global warming. So the money that's been spent has been enormous. Now, here's how I say it corrupts science. Not necessarily someone says, I believe this because I'm getting paid, but say you study butterflies. You do a study on butterflies, the university doesn't really get that much publicity, local media is not interested, you're not going to get that much funding. But then you say, hey, I'm going to look at all this money, there's all this grant money's out there. I'm going to study how a temperature increase of 6 degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit by 2075 will impact butterflies. And I'm going to do a modeling study in the Southwest United States. So then you do this study, you do some computer models, you have a low end range, a mid range, a high range, and you do it, and then you do a little summary, and you say, well, the high range, if it warms X amount, butterflies are going to be doomed. It's going to change their thing. They're going to have mass extinction. So then the university gets it. Ha, we can do something with this. They do a press release. The local media, butterflies doomed. The UN chief gets a hold of this. With new study out in peer-reviewed journal, by the way, then that butterflies are doomed by 2075 unless we act. But yet this scientist did nothing wrong. But yet he's now part of the consensus, despite having never studied whether CO2's impact on temperature would have anything near the impact it would have. He is now getting feeded, he's getting attention, he's getting more funding, but yet all he did was an if-then modeling study. So suddenly, he's on the gravy train, but he hasn't compromised his own ethics. He's now famous, he's now being cited, and now we have another study. See, who are these deniers? Are all these scientists lying? And I get asked it all the time. Let me put it to you this way. In the 1970s, late 60s and 1970s, Paul Ehrlich's the population bomb was universally shared by the mainstream media and by many of the scientists of that day. That was the consensus, if you will. And the question is, were all those scientists lying? No, they were practicing the politicized, funded science, ideologically correct science of the day. And what happened is you can watch John Lennon debate Dick Cavett in 1977 or 78. On the Dick Cavett show, John Lennon is a skeptic of overpopulation, and Dick Cavett is mocking and ridiculing him like, these scientists be wrong, you really believe that? What about all these? And John Lennon's like, these things will work themselves out. I don't care what people think of me. It's not true. It's not going to happen. John Lennon made a scientific chump out of people like John Holdren, Obama's science advisor, and Paul Ehrlich. But here's the question. Were all those scientists lying? No, that was the science of the day. And people say, well, then why believe anything in science? No, it's not that simple. Since the late 1960s, and particularly like the first Earth Day, and certainly since Rachel Carson's DDT book, I think that was 1964, the Silent Spring came out, 1964. Any scientific movement related to the environment like that gets picked up, you have to have massive distrust for all the claims. There's usually a basis for concern, there's kernels of truth, there's all that. But whatever the issue is, be it even global cooling, be it overpopulation, be it species extinction, be it sustainable development, be it deforestation, the Amazon rainforest, at the point when, in global warming, of course, at the point when it becomes a politically sensitive environmental movement and it starts getting funded, then you know it's more of a political campaign and not science. And that's what distinguishes it from most, I don't say, that's not the only difference from other science, but that's the key difference. It's activist, campaign-oriented science that's seeking an immediate solution. This isn't just scientists studying something and trying to get, the solar system, trying to get better understanding of our stars or other galaxies. This is trying to study an issue and then testifying and becoming part of a UN process and testifying in Congress and ultimately lobbying for carbon tax, or in the case of NASA's James Hansen, lobbying against oil sands, saying it's game over for the climate. When there's that kind of linkage in politicization of science, that's the difference. And people need to understand that. And the idea that all these scientists agree, well, they're all doing mostly, I think it's 2/3 of a modeling study. Mike Holm, one of the most cited climate scientists in the world in the UK, has said the idea of this consensus is essentially nonsense. He said there's only a few dozen scientists that actually study the CO2 attribution. In other words, what impact will CO2 have? And that's the bottom line. Not all these other people, anthropologists, economists, modelers, they all just pile on. We're all part of the consensus. Are we all lying? No, you're all just doing the science of the day that you're getting funded, and you're having fun with all your speculative nonsense. In many ways, whenever they come out with new proof of stuff, and whether it's Antarctic ice, most of the stuff is now based on models. And they look at stuff, and they actually call modeling projections and predictions now data. They actually say, we looked at the data. Well, modeling a prediction of 50 years from now is not data. And that's where we are. And what's interesting now is the entire debate has shifted to any weather event. And I'm sure you're familiar with any weather event is proof of man-made global warming. And whatever the weather, it's perfectly consistent with what we expected. The New York Times had a climate scientist in 2010 saying that the blizzard, bundle up, this is global warming, despite the fact that people like Al Gore never warned us of upcoming record cold and blizzards. They're blaming, and what they have is there's studies now predicting global warming predicts more snow, global warming will cause more snow, global warming will cause less snow, global warming will cause more droughts, global warming will cause less droughts. They now have opposite and contradictory studies in the peer-reviewed literature. So no matter what happens, when we had all this record blizzards and snow, people like George Monbiot in the UK were like, aha, I found this little-known study. It predicted this. We were right. The global warmers were right. No, but then you have the Climatic Research Institute, all these other scientists, Michael Oppenheimer, UN scientists, all predicting less snow. Well, which is it? Well, it depends. If we have no snow that year, that's the narrative. If we have blizzards and record snow, well, then we find this other study. No matter what happens, they actually can credibly point in the peer-reviewed literature to studies predicting the opposite thing, and the media is not going to call them on it. This is what we've become with the state of science today. It's an embarrassment. And I want to name names. People like Kevin Trenbreth have bastardized science. He's turned it to the level of religion. He says things like global warming affects all weather events. You don't need proof. It's just like saying God is everywhere. God affects every aspect of your life. I don't need proof to make that statement, and neither does Kevin Trenbreth. It's become anti-science. And this is where they are, where every weather event and the CO2 molecules seem to travel around the globe. If there's a heat wave in Moscow, that's global warming. If Alaska has a hot spell, that's global warming. If Alberta has a flood, that's global warming. And they just travel and they monitor everywhere on the globe. Activists like Bill McKibben and Heidi Cullen and Jeff Masters of Weather Underground. No matter where they go, they just try to find any example of extreme weather. So they've essentially said, global warming will cause many bad things to happen. And guess what? Bad things happen all the time. So every single day, they're proven correct. This is why Roger Pielke Jr. of the University of Colorado said very succinctly that this is no longer the level of science. This is essentially akin to the predictions of Nostradamus or the Mayan calendar, to which I would go a step further and say this is now akin to medieval witchcraft. We never used to have weather like that until those witches moved in next door. That's where they are now. When they start implying that your SUV is a weather machine, when President Obama says he can slow the rise of sea level, when President Obama says that we can do something about hurricanes and floods and droughts, we can do something about this in this November, meaning you can vote yourself better weather by voting for him, because he'll impose draconian EPA regulations which will alter weather patterns. It's as though a carbon tax could have caused Hurricane Sandy to just veer off the coast. It would have, oh, I'm not going there. They have carbon taxes. I'm going out to the Atlantic. This is the level where we have U.S. senators, Debbie Stabenow from Michigan, actually stating in an interview that she knows global warming is real. She feels it when she's flying in the form of more turbulence. So she feels global warming in the air. We have Barbara Boxer, who said we're going to have more floods and droughts unless the Senate passes a cap and trade bill. We have Barbara Boxer, who goes down on the floor of the Senate the day after devastating tornadoes in Oklahoma, blames it on global warming, and then touts a carbon tax as though somehow a tax will solve it. And the absurdity of all this is, if we faced a climate catastrophe, a man-made climate catastrophe, and we had to rely on the United Nations or the U.S. Congress to save us, we would all be doomed, because not a single proposal they've ever done would have any detectable impact on global warming using their science. And this goes back to Tom Wigley, who did some analysis for Al Gore years ago, saying that even Kyoto Protocol would have no impact. Scientists admitted we need like 40, 50 Kyotos, in the words of the late Jerry Mallman, the federal climate scientist. So what ends up happening is this becomes all symbolism. You know, we need to do this. Well, why? What impact? Obama's like, we need to pass cap and trade to keep our planet, quote, 4 or 5 degrees cooler for our grandchildren. Wow, that's impressive. Except your own EPA just testified that not only would the cap and trade bill that failed in the U.S. Congress have not impacted global temperature, it wouldn't even impact global CO2 level. So, Mr. President, how is that going to keep our planet 4 or 5 degrees cooler? It doesn't matter. No one calls them on it. They move on. This is where we are. That's why I call it climate astrology. We call it tabloid climatology. This is why they generally don't like to debate. And when they do debate, like we had this debate at congressional field hearing, they're much more reasonable in person. You won't hear these kind of claims. There was not a single person on their side citing any of these kind of statistics. They were all trying to sound very reserved. More CO2 equals a warming world. They get very cagey. Anyway. Yes.
Can I just come back to the politics for a moment?
Yes.
Barack Obama has just in the last couple of days put climate change very much back on the agenda for the United States. And you mentioned the failure of a previous attempt to introduce cap and trade in the US. Can we expect a similar piece of legislation? Is he telegraphing what he might do as a result of this?
Well, here's the beauty of this. From his point of view, he's being very smart politically. When you come to the American people front on, like Al Gore did, like these United Nations report did, like they did with cap and trade, people are going to reject it. Why? Because there's such skepticism. People don't have to be scientists to understand that this is just horse shit. There's just no other way around it. So they've learned. Barbara Boxer, the chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee, the Senate committee that deals with global warming legislation, has said openly this year, and John Kerry's echoed this, the Secretary of State and others, President Obama doesn't need anything from Congress. Congress doesn't have to do anything on global warming. The president can do it all. Why? Because in 2007, the United States Supreme Court allowed the Environment Protection Agency can, if it so chooses, to regulate CO2 as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. So President Obama doesn't need Congress anymore to do these regulations. Now, Congress can still get involved by defunding the EPA, by not approving the EPA administrator, by doing all sorts of things, and then you can also have lawsuits trying to prevent this. However, when you have a nameless, faceless bureaucrats behind this, doing it behind the scenes, essentially cap and trade and essentially the impact a carbon tax would have, behind the scenes, it's going to be much more effective. The American people are less likely to be aware of it because it's going to take instead of taking the form of a big, brassy congressional debate about the merits of the science of global warming and the solutions and the cost, it's going to happen behind the scenes as they shut down coal plants, as they start regulating fracking, as they start more regulations on oil drilling, as they start shutting down carbon-based energy. And frankly, it's boring. If I go on TV and talk about EPA boiler max standards at energy plants, people's eyes roll over. If you go on and say, hey, they want to pass a big carbon tax in Congress and Al Gore says we have to, people are fired up, they want to fight. But by taking the battle to the bureaucracy and behind the scenes, it's ingenious. They should have done this. If I was advising them, I would have told them to do this in the first place. Don't do a big frontal attack with cap and trade, with carbon taxes, with UN treaties. It ain't going to fly, at least not in America. Do it this way. Do it behind the bureaucracy, a slow creeping procession. And I give Obama kudos. I mean, I think it's completely wrong. I think it's destructive. I think it's scientifically illiterate. However, it's politically savvy and smart, and they're learning from their past mistakes. So I tip my hat to them, as disgusted as I am.
Fair enough. Now, there is a line of argument that says, aren't the sorts of changes that are proposed to combat climate change good overall anyway? Even if climate change isn't the problem, surely cleaner energy, burning less coal, using less fossil fuels, surely these are good objectives, surely these are good outcomes.
Yes, and we had former Senator Timothy Wirth of Colorado said it best, and this just shows you that they're not interested in the science. Even if we're wrong on the science of global warming, we'll be doing right by policy. And that's how you know that it's not really about the science. In fact, you can plug and play. If you go back to overpopulation, if you go back to even global cooling, they were talking about tipping points. And by the way, they were using the fierce tornadoes back then as proof of man-made global cooling. Now, any tornado, well, that's proof of man-made global warming. They just shift on a dime. But what they've done with this rhetoric of sorry, your question was about
just to do with the argument that doing something is good, yes, regardless.
What they've done, no matter what the environmental scare is, they've had the same solution: command and control economics, and that's always, whether it's species, whether it's sustainable development, whether it's a whole host of environmental issues. So whatever the latest scare is, it's always the same solution. We need to empower United Nations. We need more treaties. We need more regulations. We need more government approval bodies. We need to limit this development. We need people to oversee this. We need to manage this. And so it doesn't really matter what the science is. Now, we're mixing in pollution. Obviously, the biggest benefit to pollution, to environmentalism, is wealth and technology. And if you look back, the wealthiest countries have the cleanest environment, and technology is the way to go, not command and control, brutal, penalizing. Obama stated in 2008, before he was elected, that his goal of cap and trade was to bankrupt the coal industry. Instead, you want technology. And what I mean by that is, if you look at what fracking has done through this breakthrough in technology, now there's all sorts of incentives, there's all sorts of government subsidies that are involved. You could argue subsidies, not necessarily to carbon, but a lot of these are tax breaks, which they call subsidies. A lot of these energy companies get the same tax breaks other industries get, but somehow the environmentalists want to all call them subsidies. But the gist of it is that no matter these energy companies, the energy of I'm losing my. Well, wait, go back. We're talking about.
You were talking about the various sources of energy and the fact that the solution to all of these various problems always tends to be the regulation, the command and control.
Yes.
So the response to, just to finish this question, how would you respond to someone who comes along with that concern for the environment and thinks, well, surely doing something is good?
Yes. And sorry, I'm getting, I guess I'm
I'm
doing too much monologue here. But no, the gist of what I'm trying to say is we're getting where we need to go through technology and through advancements in there. And I was mentioning up natural gas fracking. It's replacing coal. Coal's dropping from mid-40s down to the low 30s in the United States in terms of percent of our baseload electricity. Well, since that's happened, our emission levels are dropping back down, to the 1990s levels. And without cap and trade, without UN treaties, we're dropping emissions. We're a huge success story because of technology, because of fracking. And so in that situation, you don't have to go back and say, let's subsidize coal to keep it alive. But the idea is, allow technology to go, don't shut it down. And the reason we're suspicious that's what they want to do is John Holdren, Obama's science czar, has said in the 1975 interview that one of the hazards of a free society is electricity that's too cheap, that's too inexpensive. And it's tied into resource scarcity in their minds, it's tied into overpopulation. There's always been a war on carbon-based energy, or energy that works. And if you listen to what the UK energy chief said a few years ago, we're not going to be able to have people can't get used to electricity when they need it. There's going to be essentially restrictions. And why? Because they're mandating renewable solar, wind, all this other energy that obviously that gives off energy, but not nearly the same level, and it's not ready for prime time. It's not the same level as carbon-based energy. And people say, well, why don't we let wind compete, with carbon-based energy or solar? Well, wind energy's been around since the 12th or 13th century, and it's had its ass kicked by carbon-based energy. Solar's always been, it's right around, success is right around the corner. Solar may very well at some point do it, but you can't mandate it before its time, and that's the problem. It's this meddling central planning. I don't want to be in a position where I'm against all alternative energy. However, if you start looking into wind power, you realize in its current form, an historical thing, it just doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense. In fact, James Lovelock, the UK environmentalist who became skeptical of man-made global warming, a large degree skeptical, said one of the greatest follies of Europe was their wind farms. Of the 21st century, the 20th century was their wind farms. And if you look at solar, we're finding out that solar plants, wind farms have the same environmental impact as mining industry in these areas, whether you're dealing with endangered species, whether you're dealing with land use issues, the impacts of windmills killing birds, the impacts of solar panel in terms of spreading out. And first of all, they're unsightly and ugly. And again, I'm not in a war against alternative energy. Let it develop. Let it compete. Let it develop naturally. It's going to be technology that determines it. Let's not artificially shut down our energy economy based on baseless fears of man-made global warming. And that's where we are right now. So to answer your question in short about doing the right thing by policy, we're not. The right thing by policy is to continue to grow wealth, let the developing world have wealth, and continue technology. When I was in the Senate, we had something called the Asia-Pacific Partnership, the idea of technology sharing with the Asian countries, the developing world. Let them leapfrog ahead that way, but just don't mandate. Spending money in Washington isn't controversial, never has been, probably never will be. So all the subsidies in the world, all the investments, all the companies, the crony capitalism, that's going to happen no matter how much anyone screams. But there's no reason to come in and artificially shut down coal plants. We have Mayor Bloomberg in New York bragging that his coalition with environmentalists has shut down hundreds of coal plants from going online. They're stopping them in the planning stages. This is going to have an impact down the road. And now we have the Obama administration on record as going after fracking. So no, it's not. We don't want these policies regardless of global warming. Because if we do have global warming, the greatest thing you can have for rising seas, for extreme weather, for hurricanes and storms and tsunamis is wealth. Wealth to invest in infrastructure, wealth to invest in dams, wealth to invest in all sorts of storm mitigation efforts. And that is what they're denying the developing world. When you have President Obama telling the World Bank not to allow coal plants and develop in the parts of Africa, that's immoral. When you have India telling the United Nations they won't sign on a UN treaty because 30 or 40% of their residents don't have running water and electricity, they're not going to limit their energy. You realize this is immoral to even ask them that. When you have the In Chad, in Africa, the environmental minister banning burning of charcoal for desperate families. They can't keep warm, they can't cook their food, all because of concerns about global warming. When you have the UK announce that they're going to buy local and ban produce from overseas, you have poor black Kenyan farmers protesting that decision because their livelihood depends on it. So all these things have an impact. And when you look at the developing world, when you see people like Governor Jerry Brown, who's on record, I interviewed him at an UN Earth Summit conference in 2002, he said the developing world can't develop the way we did. We have to tell them they can't make our mistakes. We have to show them the proper way. They have to leapfrog right to wind and solar. The UN chief, Rajendra Pachauri, is bragging about his solar lanterns on huts made of dung. No, I interviewed a South African activist, Leon Lowe, who said it best. When the developed world, the Western Europe and the United States, are willing to bomb Washington, D.C., Rotterdam, London, Paris, return them to swamps, jungles, and wetlands, only then do we have the moral authority to tell Africans, South Americans, and Asians, 1.6 or so billion people who don't have running water and electricity and energy poverty, that they can't develop any damn way they wish. And that includes carbon-based energy, one of the greatest liberators of mankind in the history of our planet. So to go back to your question, no, any solution to global warming that involves restricting, limiting, and preventing carbon-based energy is immoral. It is deceitful, and it is going to harm 1.6 billion people without running water and electricity in this planet, who need wealth, who need energy, and they need to get out of energy poverty. They can't have solar panels on huts made of dung. They need to get out of that lifestyle. We have people like the director of Avatar, James Cameron, who flies down with his lead star, Sigourney Weaver, to Brazil and protests hydroelectric dams, of all things, as being destructive, and then flies home. He's got twin California mansions next to each other that are just monstrosities of one of his many houses, and they fly in on private jets. This is the hypocrisy that we're seeing. These wealthy people fly in, demand that they don't have any energy put in these places, and keep the people poor, and then they fly home and they pat themselves on the back as though they've done something good. We're finding this all over. The group Oxfam, the environmental group and charity group, went to Africa and was teaching people to farm with farm animals and bull oxes instead of using tractors, because it's more environmentally sensitive to use the animals. They're doing it right. I interviewed people in South Africa. I called them green missionaries. They're like the old missionaries. They were going to the developing world and telling them that the American way, the Western Europe, the Australian way, the developed world's way of living was, quote, bullshit, and that they were doing it right. Living a primitive, subsistence, tribal life, in essence, is the correct way to do it. A nasty, brutish, short life without running water, without electricity, with high infant mortality is glamorized. On MTV, Cameron Diaz and Drew Barrymore did a show called Trippin'. They went to places like Bhutan and praised their environmental practices, praised the fact that they lived in huts made of dung. They were just beside themselves, and Drew Barrymore went out and said, I took a poo in the woods and it felt awesome. It was totally awesome. It was so cool and neat, and they were bragging about the lack of infrastructure, and they glorified these countries which are listed among the highest in infant mortality rates and in short life expectancy. This is what we get from our pop culture, and then of course, it trickles down to our children's education, where tribal life is glorified, despite the fact that American Indians or Native Americans drove buffalo to extinction, clear-cut forests. They're always portrayed as though modern man's evil, and the indigenous peoples are always at one with nature and community. And it's an amazing thing to watch. So the bottom line is no. The solutions are worse than the cure. People say, well, shouldn't we have an insurance policy? What if you're wrong about global? Shouldn't we have an insurance policy? Well, would you buy an insurance policy on your home that cost more than the house is worth and that would pay out nothing if your house burned down? That's the snake oil they're selling us. That's the con job they're selling us. And we have some very scary proposals. Hans Schulenhuber, the German climate advisor, has come out and proposed a CO2 budget for every man, woman, and child on the planet. And this would be from Berlin to Beijing. And guess what? All of us in the developing world, we've already exceeded our budgets by, I can't remember if it was 5 or 10 times. So essentially it's a way of transferring wealth to the developing world. And in UK, they have a proposal years ago for a carbon ration card, where your employer monitors your train travel, your airline travel, your home energy use, your transportation. If you exceed your carbon budget, then you owe money. If you're under it, you get some sort of credit. This is scary stuff. I mean, it's level of control George Orwell didn't predict. It's as Richard Lindzen, the MIT scientist, said, he who controls carbon dioxide, a trace essential gas in the atmosphere, we inhale oxygen, exhale CO2, controls life. He who controls carbon dioxide controls life. And that's what's so scary about where they're headed with these regulations. We can talk about higher energy costs in the United States and Australia and Europe, but you're talking about lives in the developing world. If they can't get access to modern carbon-based energy, Africa needs infrastructure, Africa needs hospitals, Africa needs electricity. Africa is poised. In fact, the highest growth rates are in sub-Saharan Africa right now. Africa needs economic development and is poised to do it as long as they're not prevented or starved from energy. And the problem is the United Nations goal, and we're seeing this in Hollywood celebrities, they're buying carbon credits and they're putting off vast stores of land to all these poor people in the developing world. When I was in the Senate, I think it was either Norway or Sweden, embassy representatives came and they had some carbon plan where, you know, people could buy carbon credits where they would then buy trees, swaths of trees in Africa and put them off for development. So it would assuage the liberals' guilt for traveling. And the problem is that's basically giving the potentially corrupt political leaders in Africa money now so they don't develop their forests, and meanwhile the people suffer because they can't then, you know, develop economically. And this is a perverse incentive, and some people have just said it bluntly. The white, wealthy Western world is telling people of color, predominantly people of color in Africa, South America, and Asia, that they can't develop. And that's a new form of colonialism. As Philip Stott, the UK, said, this is neo-colonialism, where we're telling them how they can develop. We're essentially dictating them, and we're holding them hostage in many ways through UN treaties, through UN proposals, and even through trade policies with, you know, Europe not allowing GMO food to come from Africa, and countries like countries becoming net food exporters to net food importers. I mean, it's a really sad situation, and ultimately it's immoral. And so this is where the lives of this carbon, the climate con come from. And that's where we are with it.
I hate to interrupt you when you're
Sure.
on a roll, but I'm mindful that we're on a limited time budget.
Sure.
And I just want to go back to something that we talked about early on. What are some of the specific scientific issues that have led you to be convinced that CO2 is not driving climate change? Whether there are many predictions that have been made, many things that we've been told we should see. Why don't you believe that?
Well, first of all, modern temperatures are not unprecedented. They tried to claim this, the UN report in 2001, with Michael Mann's hockey stick. They tried to say this is the hottest it's been in 1,000 years. And they had this chart that looked like a hockey stick. That was supposed to be the most compelling #1 piece of evidence. Then, of course, that was totally destroyed by Steve McIntyre and Ross McKittrick. And not only that, but then there's been quite literally hundreds of scientists with tons of studies showing the medieval warm period was as warmer than today in both northern and southern hemisphere. We know that. We now also know that the Roman warming period during the time around, say, Jesus Christ was as warm or warmer than today. So first of all, temperatures aren't unprecedented now by any standard. We also know that current weather is not unprecedented, whether you're talking tornadoes. Tornadoes are actually a big drop since the 1950s. We know that floods on 127 years are showing no trend. We know that droughts globally and in the United States are actually showing a decline, no trend globally. We know that hurricanes are in a drought currently. We know that sea level is showing no acceleration. It's been rising since the end of the last ice age, and it's not showing the acceleration predicted. We know that the climate models have failed us, particularly the last 15 to 17 years, even though it's a short time scale. So on all of these metrics, and you can go from A to Z, we look at Arctic ice. The Arctic is probably their strongest piece of evidence. You think, well, if that's not going to convince you, why wouldn't that? Well, satellite monitoring of the Arctic went up in 1979 during the high point, right the tail end of the global cooling hysteria. We had a 40-year cooling period from 1940 to roughly the late 70s, global cooling period. So it goes up at the end of 1979. Now, there was data that shows 1974 and other areas goes back even further, and it shows the ice fluctuating significantly. So the idea that's unprecedented, that we've had an unprecedented ice loss is wrong, especially if you look back to the 1930s and 1940. It's another high point of warmth in the Arctic. According to Russian ships, other data points, they had similar amounts of ice back then, but we didn't have the satellite monitoring to prove it, so it becomes more of a dueling observational, trying to reconstruct the past. So the Arctic doesn't pan out. You look at the Antarctic, we've had record sea ice expansion, and we've had, even the glaciers aren't showing a global warming signal. Well, they're starting to come out with studies now using models and estimates. They're trying to say, well, the sea ice is growing, but the land ice isn't. And by the way, the sea ice is growing as expected. This is what we would expect under global warming. Well, then we go back 5 years, and they weren't. They were expecting sea ice to shrink according to global warming. So it's almost, the question should be reversed, is like, what evidence do they have that we're causing it? And they'll then talk about CO2. I've already told you the CO2 levels aren't alarming. We're in a CO2 famine, geologically speaking, according to scientists like Will Happer, according to people like Don Easterbrook, the geologist from University of Washington, Western Washington. So I don't know. Their evidence, they'll try to claim unprecedented temperatures, new normal unprecedented weather. They try to claim the CO2 levels to scare you. None of it adds up upon any investigation. Then they try to, with their biggest thing they try to hit you with is all these scientists agree. Well, that's nonsense. You know, the UN, there's 52 scientists that sign off on the summary for policymakers, and that summary for policymakers, which is widely disseminated in the media and the public, every line has to be signed off on by UN leaders, delegates, bureaucrats, with the scientists. It's not a scientific process. And this is where the nonsense comes. And so what ends up happening is, in 2/3 of the UN is essentially modeling studies, again, if then this happens, and economic impacts, all this stuff, all these scientists. It's not even 1,000 scientists. They'll claim thousands of scientists, but they're not even all scientists. They're anthropologists and other things. But when their strongest points are, you got to look at where's their evidence. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. They come up with the consensus, which is, you realize, is totally manufactured. Even people like Judith Curry, who essentially converted from a global warming alarmist, she's an atmospheric scientist, University of Georgia, or Georgia Tech. She went from a global warming alarmist, if you will, to a lukewarmer, I guess you'd say, in the middle. You know, she's not quite a skeptic completely, but she calls it the manufactured consensus. So they have the consensus, which doesn't hold up. They have unprecedented current temperatures and weather, and that doesn't hold up in any way, shape, or form. So what are they left with? A bunch of speculative theories that CO2 is going to cause some catastrophe at some point in the future. At some point you start thinking, well, wait a minute, what is this consensus? The consensus is that a small cadre of well-funded, organized scientists centered around the United Nations, people like Michael Mann, Michael Oppenheimer, Kevin Trenbrith, Phil Jones, all sit around and agree that the future is going to be bad. So the consensus turns out to be a bunch of people agreeing that the future is going to be scary, that they're predicting, that they agree on predictions of the future. That's a big difference. The Economist magazine came out and actually said, if the consensus was CO2 has some warming impact, that's a big difference than CO2 is driving a climate catastrophe. And as I said, hundreds of factors influence global temperature. Everything from, you know, the ocean cycles, water vapor, tilt of the Earth's axis. It just goes on in terms of land use policies, deforestation. So the idea that CO2 is the driver doesn't hold up. So I'm trying to find any evidence that their theory holds, and it's just not there. Because and if you look at the most recent developments, they're now claiming that this 15-year plateau, whatever words they want to use, is just, you know, a very small thing that all the heat is hiding in the deep oceans. Well, the scientists who study this, Bob Tisdale, John Christie, climatologist, climatologist Roger Pilkey Sr., they're all scratching their heads. We can't find this heat that you claim is there. And you know, someone joked and said, you know, this is, I think it was on Junk Science, global warming, the oceans ate our global warming. That's what the scientists are now claiming. They're claiming the heat is hiding. It's there. It's just hiding. And that doesn't make sense. Then you have a study that comes out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in 2010 or 11, claiming that Chinese coal use is one of the reasons for the global warming plateau, that it's putting up all these aerosols and essentially blocking the sun. And it's amazing. So coal is saving us from dangerous global warming. When after the fact they start coming up with all these explanations of why they were wrong, but they're just as certain now that they're right, you just know they're falling apart. And that's what I find. So I'm hard pressed to find any shred of compelling evidence for this climate catastrophe. Now, if the evidence is, will CO2 have a warming effect? Yes, but so do many other. Mankind can both can contribute to heating, and we can contribute to cooling through aerosols, so, and land use and other factors. So the idea that it's as simple as they made, they'll say, oh, this is as settled as gravity. Really? Well, then something's going on, because gravity must not be too settled, because you guys have shifted massively now. All these high-end projections of warming are now dropping to the low end, and they're all scratching their heads looking for the missing heat. So I can't tell you where their evidence is. I'm still searching for it. I just don't. Their evidence exists. Someone said the evidence exists in the electrons of the computer of the climate modelers. That's where their evidence exists. And if you look, take it polar bears as an example. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, they were the poster child. You don't hear much about polar bears. Gee, why don't we hear about polar bears? U.S. Geological Survey, they're at or near historic population highs in the Arctic. The Inuit people have come out, and many different tribes up there have literally said there is absolutely no problem. There's more polar bears here than we've seen in many, many years. Peer-reviewed studies are showing population counting. New counts are now, we used to say 20 to 25,000, now they're up to 32,000. We're finding polar bears underweight. Oh my gosh, that's it, global warming is causing it. No, that's typical of areas where there's too many polar bears and not enough food because the population's exploding. So polar bears have literally collapsed as their talking point. They don't even talk about them anymore. Of course, Coca-Cola will still do them on their cans. They're cute, they're fuzzy, they're different environmental groups. But it's amazing. The question is, where is there evidence for man-made global warming? And it all comes down to modeling. I had a debate with Scott Denning, a very articulate and very good spokesman for the global warming side, talking about how many watts per meter each additional unit, and it's like putting out, essentially toasting the atmosphere, and it's going to be blocking all. It just doesn't hold up because you look at the geologic record, you look at how the Earth is such a vastly complex system with all these factors. My favorite quotes are Reed Bryson, who's considered by some the father of climatology. He died a few years ago, but he actually said you could go outside and spit and have the same effect as doubling CO2 in the atmosphere. And there's other UN scientists have said you could have a tripling of CO2 in the atmosphere and you wouldn't notice. And then you start saying, well, that's nonsense. But then look at the geologic record. As I said, we've had ice ages with CO2 at 2,000 parts per million. We're only at 400 today. So, and then people will say, well, that's a weak sun that caused all these other factors. And they try to do this, they try to come up with any kind of spin. They'll say, well, the medieval warm period, we know what caused that. We did computer simulations and we tried to, they always claim that these computer models, as though they can account. What's interesting is Kevin Trenbreth, the UN scientist, admitted that these climate models don't account essentially for half the variability. Renwick, another UN scientist, said they don't account for half the variability in nature. They're not predictions, they're merely emissions scenarios. And people use them, and the media runs with them, environmentalists run with them, activist scientists run, as though these predictions are data. And that's where we are. Their greatest evidence exists in their predictions. And whenever we validate their predictions, they fail. But again, it's kind of like those peer-reviewed studies. They can always find a prediction that came true. And so if we say, oh, you didn't predict it, they'll find some scientist who did a low-end prediction of 20 years. Oh, he did, he's right. Look at that, we predicted it. But you'll ignore all this other stuff. It's like the three-card Monty trick card game. They're going to have a way out of it no matter what, rhetorically.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, and
Sure.
I want to get your thoughts specifically on the modelling, the economic modelling that underpins the 50-to-1 project. And in particular, this idea, as you alluded to before, that perhaps the cure might actually be worse than the disease. We have a carbon emissions reduction scheme in Australia. We have an emissions tax in the EU. I believe there was a Chicago exchange running out of Chicago for a while, a carbon emissions exchange. What are we likely to see in the future, and what should we do, given what you know and given your understanding, in these places that have these schemes? What can we do about them?
Well, hopefully the voters can overturn. In the case of Australia, I don't know, maybe you can repeal this carbon tax. I don't know. In the UK, there's been some encouragement. Some of the countries are actually rolling back. In Spain, they're having disasters. They're going to be forced at some point to take a look at this and start rolling stuff back. The UK seems poised to start letting standards get, a lot of these mandates fall. I think it's not going to be a big collapse instantly, but it's going to be a slow death. Once the public, especially if we go into continued cooling and plateaus, once the public is not behind this, and there's a political price for politicians to go at a rally, even among their base, to start, we're going to fight global warming, or we've got to. Once they lose that kind of power, which they've lost in the United States, President Obama admitted this. His dial testing, meaning you get focus group during a State of the Union. When he mentioned climate change and addressing it, one of the lowest things, he said the numbers, when he admitted this in an interview, that his dial tested went way down. And these are among people that the White House assembles. So this is not a hotbed of libertarian conservative skeptics. This is the general public it represents. That's powerful. In the United States, we defeated the cap and trade bill because they rammed it through raw power, paid off promises. They got it through Congress in June of 2009. Then they had a summer recess, and all these congressmen went home, and senators went home to their district, and the Senate was poised to take up and vote on this climate bill in the fall of 2009. Well, what happened? They went home and had town hall meetings of people, just little communities all across the country. People showed up. They had just passed the climate bill. Senators and congressmen stood up and tried to say, we must address global warming. They were booed, jeered, laughed at, mocked, ridiculed. The summer of 2009 was the transformative summer for the United States. Global warming became politically toxic that summer. And by the fall, Harry Reid, the Senate leader, was nowhere near ever going to bring that bill to a vote. It never came to a vote. And John Kerry, who's now Secretary of State, then Senator, admitted it's extraordinary. You mentioned climate change, it's rolled over. They admitted it became toxic and no one would touch it. That's when it happened. The public has to be outraged and make a political price for it. And that's why I say Obama's going to very likely, I don't want to say get away with it, but Obama's doing the best he can do with this because he's now not asking for public to get involved. He's not asking for a congressional vote. He's not going to have Congress switchboard shut down. He's not going to have calls running 80-1 as some of them did back in 2009 because this is going to be the EPA doing it. And you're going to have to, it's going to have to come from skeptics in the Republican Party to try to essentially gin up opposition because this is a quiet bureaucracy doing very arcane policy wonk stuff with energy regulations, and it's going to be very boring to talk about. People's eyes are going to glaze over if we start talking about EPA energy plant regulations. It's just not going to work. So this is brilliant what they're doing. But to answer your question, you got to make it politically toxic, and that's essentially happening everywhere. The mayor of London, what's his name? Boris something. Yeah, anyway, he just came out and he's considered to be one of the prime candidates for prime minister and sounds like a very strong global warming skeptic. Imagine if Britain now, in the forthcoming future, elects a global warming skeptic. That's going to be powerful, a huge signal to the rest of Europe. Before we only had, Václav Klaus maybe in Europe, in the Czech Republic.
We've got time perhaps for just one final statement, if you will, and then we're going to have to finish. So any further thoughts, any last thoughts that you want to add to the end of that before we finish up?
Yeah, I would just say that the entire global warming movement has been so well funded, so well organized. It came from essentially the ashes of the global cooling movement in the 1970s. With some of the same rhetoric, they said that climatologists were skeptical politicians would act, that we were running out of time, the idea of a tipping point, the idea that tornadoes were caused by man-made global cooling, the idea of this urgency, the idea of geoengineering. They had all the same rhetoric in the 70s. They were talking about dropping soot on the Arctic. So they have all this, they have it all down. They have the playbook down, and they have the funding like no other environmental scare in the history of the environmental movement has ever been funded like this. No other environmental movement has been organized like this. So I don't expect this to just drop away. It's morphed. It's already gone from unprecedented global warming to now the new normal with weather, climate change, global weirding, as the New York Times likes to call it, their columnists. And that's what they're trying to do. So they're really working on this. And we'll see where this goes. The idea of any weather event, it's global warming, your SUV, it never used to be like this. People are always susceptible to their experience on life is unique and different and unique to their, and they always want to believe that their time. So I think as this battle goes forward, I don't expect the other side to lose and just disappear. I expect that old eco-scares don't die, they usually morph into another one. And at one point they were trying species extinction. In fact, the UN chief Rajendra Pachauri said that global warming is but a symptom of a larger problem, sustainable development. And they had a big UN Earth Summit, but that was such a political disaster that they sort of abandoned that. And then Hurricane Sandy hit and Obama got reelected. And they decided to go full bore with this all bad weather events are proof of global warming, and they're really trying this. So if the United States can get suckered into this, that's a huge coup for the global warming movement internationally. And then I think it would be much more set up down the road, especially if we end up with another Democratic president here, to start latching on to some UN climate treaty down the road, although the UN process is a whole nother disaster. They're probably 10 years away in shambles. It's always been fun to watch that. It's always a big sham.
Look, I'm really sorry to cut you off. We've got a time limit here
Sure.
in the room that we're in. I get the feeling we could probably talk for hours,
Okay.
and perhaps I should come back at some point in the future and really get the rest of your thoughts. But it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Topher.
I really thank you
Appreciate
for your
it.
time.
All right, thank you very much. All right.